Hello everyone. In this video I'll be talking about how to estimate and interpret mediation analysis, and this is done taking into consideration the diverse school of thoughts by which we draw inferences in estimating and interpreting mediation results. So right here we have a model that theorizes that trust predicts job commitment, and that job commitment also predicts knowledge sharing. Bear in mind that we have two approaches to mediation, and one of these approaches is known as the transmittal approach. And right here, job commitment is the mediator in this model. And as a mediator, following the transmittal approach, it argues that job commitment mediates the relationship between trusts and knowledge sharing. This means a model like this, you would have to develop only one hypothesis. On the other hand, if we draw up an arrow from trusts, so we say or theorize that trust predicts knowledge sharing as well in this model, this would reflect the segmentation approach. For the segmentation approach, you would need to develop 4 hypotheses if you have a model like this. Basically, every direct path is taken into consideration, and so is the mediator and the path of the mediation taken into consideration as well. Should you have a model like this, you have to ask yourself what theory supports a direct effect and a mediating effect in a particular model. So if trust is argued or theorized to have a direct effect on knowledge sharing, and also must need go through job commitment to knowledge sharing, then it has to be based on theory. You've got to have a theoretical support for that. On the other hand, if trust only has to go through job commitment to knowledge sharing based on what the theory stipulates, then that should be the case. This also depends on whom you're citing, the literature you're working with. In the estimation or interpretation of the results, you'll find more information as we proceed. But for now, we will be working on the assumption that trust has a direct effect on knowledge sharing, and also is the relationship between trust and knowledge sharing is mediated by job commitment. Let's find out if that's true or not. To do that, we go to consistent PLS because we want to get more consistent results. Another thing to consider as well is when you use consistent PLS, it mimics the factor-based analysis approach, which is the covariant-based structural equation modeling technique. So it mimics that. So there might be need for you to put in the model fit criteria. or model fit indices. Whereas if you are focused on prediction-oriented assessment of your model, then you might want to consider PLS algorithm, the basic PLS algorithm. This would not require the need for model fit assessments, but you definitely have to follow suit. I'll put it up in a different video when it comes to model fit assessments based on recent publications or recent standards. So I'll just go test the bootstrap to see if there's a mediation or not. Bootstrap at 2000. I'll leave this at 2000. However, note that the recommended value is 5000 and not 2000. But for the sake of speed in this video tutorial, I'll leave it at 2000. And complete bootstrapping, two-tailed, okay. All good. You might want to tick this because you also have mediation. You want to connect all LVS. Path, it has got to be in path. And then you run. Let's see what we get. Okay, so right away we'll go straight to specific indirect effects, okay, to have much clearer view of the mediating effects and to see if it's significant or not. It's particularly useful as well when you have multiple mediators in a particular model. So we'll click, and here we go. We've got a significant mediating effect. Interesting. Okay, we've got a significant mediating effect. The p-values are really, really good. Okay, so here we can theorize that trust, or the relationship between trust and knowledge sharing, is mediated by job commitment. So this is where it gets a bit tricky with interpreting how this mediation occurs. How would you interpret the mediation? Yes, we know it mediates the relationship between trust and knowledge sharing, but in what way does it do that? So this is where there's a bit of confusion or a heightened debate as to the model specification here. So if you say it's got a full mediation, because yes, it's significant, but apparently there is a mediation going on, a significant mediation going on. So if you argue that it's got a full mediation, then you would be invariably telling the readers out there that job commitment, for example, which is our mediator here, is the only variable, I repeat, that can mediate the relationship between trusts and knowledge sharing, which is a bit ambiguous and preposterous in some sense, because it's going to be argued to be irrational to think that only job commitment can mediate the relationship between trust and knowledge sharing. There are several other omitted variables that could be considered as well as mediators or possible mediators, which was not accounted for. So now that's a problem, isn't it? In that case, how would you argue or interpret it? On the other hand, if you say just because trust also has a positive effect on knowledge sharing, even though there's a mediation going on. Then if you argue that it's got a partial mediation, then that would probably mean that yes, job commitment is not the only access point to knowledge sharing by trust. Meaning trust can also go directly or directly predict knowledge sharing. So you want to argue that that is a partial mediation. That is also something you might want to consider with respect to your theory, your objectives, and the questions you're trying to find answers to. Research questions, I mean. So taking into consideration some of the diverse school of thoughts and their recommendations, or in this sense, their debates about mediation analysis, some argue that you should routinely test the direct effect of trust and knowledge sharing first before you test if there is mediation or not. That way you'll be able to see if there is a full or a partial mediation. And another school of thought argues that that violates the principle of parsimony. On this note, I would say that if your theory argues or advocates or assumes that trust predicts or should predict knowledge sharing, and that job commitment mediates or should mediate the relationship between trust and knowledge sharing, then by all means predict or hypothesize accordingly. On the other hand, if your theory or your research question as well and your objectives do not clearly support the argument that trust predicts knowledge sharing and the relationship is also possibly mediated by job commitment, then you might want to stick to just arguing that job commitment mediates the relationship between trust and knowledge sharing, and that should be what you would have in your model alone. That said, you would want to consider deleting this. You would want to consider deleting this R. So we can see that in this model, it is possible to reflect both the transmittal and segmentation approaches. So if you argue, just make only one hypothesis, which is the mediation effect that job commitment mediates the relationship between trust and knowledge sharing, then it mirrors the transmittal approach or transmittal mediation approach. But if you argue otherwise, argue for the mediation effect and the total effect, which combines the effects of the mediation and also the direct effects, then it mirrors a segmentation mediation approach. So what sense would you make of these results? We can see that after running the t-statistics via the consistent PLS bootstrap approach, we can find that this is significant. The part between trust and job commitment is significant. The part between job commitment and knowledge sharing is significant. However, the path between trust and knowledge sharing is not significant because it is less than 1.96. In this particular model, for you to know how or what role the mediator plays exactly, in this case job commitment, you might want to consider first if there is a direct path as well. Okay, if you are having a segmentation mediation model, You might want to look out for the direct path as well, which is in this case trust and knowledge sharing, and check if it's significant or not. If it is not significant, as it is in our case, it is not significant, then the next thing you look for is the sign of the mediation in the output. Okay, so this is for specific indirect effects. Okay, we have to come here, remember, specific indirect effects, and the sign here is a positive sign. There's no negative sign shown. If it was negative sign, then it would appear somewhere around here. Okay, so it's a positive sign and it is quite significant based on the p-values. So we would argue along the line that job commitment, all right, going back to the model, since it has got a positive sign here and the direct path here is not significant, we would argue along the lines that job commitment mainly positively mediates. Okay, it positively mediates the relationship between trust and knowledge sharing. It does not fully mediate or partially mediate. Okay, it just positively mediates the relationship between trust and knowledge sharing. On the other hand, building on the assumption that the path between trust and knowledge sharing was significant, if this was significant, we would argue, okay, if this was significant and job commitment being as it is, having a positive sign based on the outputs here, okay, we would argue along the lines that job commitment complements the relationship between trust and knowledge sharing. Okay, assuming this was significant and job commitments in specific indirect effect has a positive result here as it is indicated. If there was a negative sign here, you would argue along the line, assuming that this was significant, the path between trust and knowledge sharing was significant, and job commitment had a negative sign in the output here, you would argue along the line that job commitment is a competitive mediator. Okay, it's a competitive mediator. So it's not a complementary mediator here, but a competitive mediator. So as a competitive mediator, job commitment can be argued to reduce the magnitude of relationship between trust and knowledge sharing. That's how you explain it if you've got a competitive mediator. On the other hand, if you've got a complementary mediator, you would argue along the lines that job commitment increases the magnitude of relationship between trust and knowledge sharing. So you don't argue if there is a full or partial mediation. Okay, this is how you explain your mediation effect.